Modern people like yourself, born in today's world, are mostly born into individualistic cultures. Such cultures place a strong emphasis on being a confident and strong individual who does not care what others think and does what is right regardless of what the crowd does. Such features can be detected in the ancient world, but with far less emphasis. Instead, ancient cultures revolved around public honor and shame. What you were in the ancient world was defined by how you were seen publicly. Why is this important? Well, we often read the biblical text through our modern lenses and do not realize how important honor and shame were for the ancient world. And because of this, we miss a lot about what the biblical stories are saying because we lack the cultural context of ancient honor-based societies. The first thing we need to note is what honor and shame meant in the ancient world. Joseph Plevnik defines honor as a claim to worth that is publicly acknowledged. To have honor is to have publicly acknowledged worth. Shame, as the opposite of honor, is a claim to worth that is publicly denied and repudiated. To be shamed is always negative. It means to be denied or to be diminished in honor. Honor is what an ancient person strived to obtain, and it was more of a group value. One's identity came from the honor and value they obtained from their community. So your identity would be something your community would give you. It did not come from internal markers you may have about yourself. It came from what your community said about you. Mark Strauss notes honor was the gaining of status from others, and shame is the loss of it from others. In contrast, in today's world, one is encouraged more to do things that avoid causing internal guilt, and one is encouraged to have high self-esteem. You're encouraged to have your own identity and to stand out. Modern cultures focus more about internal feelings instead of external appearances. This is not to say the ancient world ignored internal feelings, like we do not ignore the importance of honor and shame today. But it is more about the importance each culture places on these paradigms. The ancient world cared more about public honor than having self-esteem. Things like wealth and power were often vehicles to obtain public honor, over an internal sense of gratification. Now, honor could be achieved in mainly two ways. You could inherit it by being born into a certain class or family. If your grandfather was a war hero, you would be born with that honor. Or honor could be acquired, like from your deeds, how you conduct yourself, or how well you hold up to expectations. Aiding in keeping the order of society would bring honor not only to you, but to your family. Acts such as marrying without your family's consent, running away, or engaging in activities outside of your class could bring public shame to you and your family. The key point to take away is how connected you were to your family, class, and society. If you acted honorably, it would reflect on your community and family. If you acted shamefully, it would reflect badly on your community, and you could be ostracized for your actions. Everything you did affected the others around you. One would likely view themselves more as a member of something primarily, instead of an individual who just belongs to certain groups, which is how we would view ourselves today. For example, I would say of myself that I'm an individual who is a Christian, a member of the Jones family, and an American citizen. In the ancient world, the group connections were primary and defined who you were more so than merely being aspects of you. An ancient Israelite would see their national identity as more central to themselves than I might see my American nationality. I, as an individual, would be fine if I needed to move to a new country and change my citizenship. My American identity is not as central as it would have been for an ancient person. An ancient Israelite would consider themselves an entirely new person if they lost their Israelite identity. Who they were was defined by their group associations. When we read of Abram leaving his family in Haran and going to Canaan, we don't really see this as a big deal. We often think of it as if someone is just moving across the country and taking a new job. The same applies to Ruth. We just view it as if she's going to live with her in-laws. But for the ancient world, this would have been shocking to read. Ruth was essentially abandoning her identity and becoming a whole new person for the sake of her mother-in-law. It required not just moving to a new country, but religious and ideological changes. It would be more akin to a devout fundamentalist Muslim becoming a Jew. Likewise, Abram was being asked to become a whole new person with a whole new identity. What God is saying in Genesis 12:1 is essentially, get out of your country, get out of your family, get out of the house of your father, leave everything you are behind, and I will give you a whole new identity. All the honor you had been given from your family, status, and country is to be left behind, and you'll start from scratch in a new land. Even his name would change. Honor came from the community's perception of you. Joseph Hellerman says, in the collectivist cultures of antiquity, one's honor was almost exclusively dependent upon the affirmation of the claim to honor by the larger social group to which the individual belonged. To abandon it and start over in a new place was a far more drastic change than someone who is moving to a new location in an individualistic culture. Your identity today comes more from internal markers of who you identify as. In collectivist cultures, identity revolved around public honor and shame. To move to a new community is to be identified as someone new. Because of this, right and wrong actions centered more around how they appeared before the community. Richards and O'Brien say, in shame cultures, people are more likely to choose right behavior on the basis of what society expects from them. It is not a matter of guilt, nor an inner voice of direction, but outer pressures and opinions that direct the person to behave a certain way. Quintilian taught that public honor was the fundamental factor to convince someone to do something or avoid a wrong action. Aristotle taught shame was a powerful motivator for social control. Proverbs 21:21 says, one ought to do what is right, so they will be given honor. So for example, if a person stole or murdered with the approval of the community, then he had no reason to feel bad about his actions. His identity came from what the community thought of him, not from an internal sense of right and wrong, or an internal conscience telling him how he should be. Remember that Paul admits he thought himself as faultless, even though he was persecuting Christians before his conversion. His community approved of his actions, so there was no need to worry about right and wrong beyond that culturally relative parameter. It wasn't an internal sense of guilt that made him change, but visible and public shaming from the Lord. There is no indication Peter thought he was doing anything wrong by refusing to eat with the uncircumcised. It wasn't until Paul confronted him that he realized his sin. People in collectivist cultures had a harder time seeing sin as sin if their community approved of their actions, because their identity came from the community. If no one shamed them, then their identity was not threatened. If they were still receiving honor, their identity was considered in good standing. Honor was also perceived as a zero-sum game, meaning you could not gain honor unless you took it from someone else. Trying to take too much honor could be perceived as bad, and actually could bring shame back upon the person. Sometimes people often wonder why Jesus would heal someone and then tell the person to tell no one. The reason likely stems from the honor standards of the ancient world. If Jesus was seen as constantly trying to proclaim his divine powers, it might be taken as trying to claim too much honor. Telling those he healed to not tell anyone was a way to assure the community he was not performing miracles to claim honor for himself, but that he only wanted to help. Also, a key issue we often miss is how public conversations were not attempts to obtain information, but were actually public honor challenges. When the Pharisees came to Jesus to ask a question, this was an attempt to win over the crowds and steal honor from Jesus. This is often why Jesus replies as harshly as he does. He understood an honor challenge was at play. Malina and Neyrey note that every social interaction that takes place outside of one's family or one's circle of friends is perceived as a challenge to honor. If someone truly wanted information, they would have done as Nicodemus had done and came to Jesus privately at night to speak with him. You'll notice how much nicer Jesus is in this conversation versus the public confrontations. When the Pharisees and scribes are confronting Jesus, This is an attempt to show the crowds he doesn't know what he's talking about and win them over to their side. One example is in the Gospel of Mark. Just after Jesus cleanses the temple, the chief priests present a question to Jesus and attempt to challenge him and win the people to their side. By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority to do them? Now, instead of answering them, Jesus replies with a challenge of his own. I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. Mark records the priests recognize the trap. If they say John was of God, then Jesus can ask them why they didn't believe him. But if they say John was not of divine origin, then the people, who believed John was a real prophet, would doubt them as effective leaders. So they had to give in to Jesus' challenge and effectively lose the honor game. This might not seem like a big deal, but in the shame cultures of the ancient world, this would have been an offense that would have made the loser want to kill the winner. And this is only one example where the gospel authors record that Jesus was able to publicly shame his opponents and gain honor. Joseph Hellerman says, Jesus victoriously enhanced his honor at the expense of the Jewish leaders who confronted him. And the public shame to which Jesus subjected these esteemed representatives of the Jewish Sanhedrin surely contributed toward the fate he suffered only a few days later as he hung on a Roman cross. Richards and O'Brien say, the Jewish officials didn't kill him for going around preaching love one another, or for healing the sick, or performing miracles. They killed him because he had taken their honor, a limited resource. Despite our modern sensibilities, the Jewish leaders would not have considered what they did as wrong. By publicly shaming Jesus, they were merely taking back their honor, which they would have believed was stolen from them. When the community saw Jesus publicly killed as a criminal, it would have been perceived as if Jesus' honor was fairly taken from him, and if he truly was the Son of God, then he should have been easily able to win it back instead of dying. We can see the honor challenge happen when Jesus is mocked. The point was, if Jesus truly was of divine origin, he should be able to answer his mockers and take back his honor. His silence was perceived not as humility, but as being unable to answer them due to weakness, humiliation, or shame. Therefore, the priests were perceived as doing nothing wrong and handing him over to be executed. Jesus could not respond properly and take back his honor, so he must deserve what's coming to him. Now I understand, all of this sounds odd. How could they not have an internal sense of guilt or conscience guiding their actions, regardless of what the community thought? We will see later that Judeo-Christian thought based on God's omniscience is what would contribute to this paradigm change. An appeal to the real presence and witness of the Holy Spirit would work initially as the external shaming of sin that would eventually be remodeled into an internal sense of following one's conscience. But such a process took time to emerge, and just because we think in these modern terms, that doesn't mean we can impose our modern paradigm onto the ancient world. Richards and O'Brien provide an excellent example of how this misunderstanding often happens by going over the account of David's affair with Bathsheba. We tend to impose onto the text the idea that David knew what he did was wrong, but stubbornly refused to repent due to his pride. The prophet Nathan was able to get David to listen to his conscience. But Richards and O'Brien explain this is probably not what is happening. The account is steeped in honor and shame language, and we often miss it because we don't understand the culture and assume our own cultural convictions regarding introspection and conscience. Here's how they explain what is happening. The story begins by noting David was not with the army, but lounging back in Jerusalem. David's honor is already being challenged by the authors by noting he was not where the king should have been. Then they write that one night David got up from his bed and saw a woman bathing. Now, we tend to think David was sort of acting like a peeping Tom. Bathsheba was trying to privately bathe, and David caught a glimpse of her without her knowing. Now, it's possible Bathsheba was taken advantage of, but scholars note this might not be the case. Women would likely not bathe in public places where they could be seen. It was also late in the evening, so it is unlikely David would have been able to see her in the dark unless she was in an open and visible area, like at a community well. So it's unlikely she just happened to be bathing in a place where she could be seen from the king's rooftop, even at night. It's more likely she was trying to let David know she was available. David called for servants to inquire about her, and a servant says, "Is that not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" This very question is expected in an honor and shame society. The servant doesn't tell David who Bathsheba is, because it would shame the king for a servant to know something David did not. So he phrases the information in the form of a question, so David can answer yes and save face. Next, David takes advantage of her, and then we find out she is pregnant. We tend to assume this was a private affair, but the community would likely have known about it. David used servants to bring her to him, and so the palace staff would have been aware of the situation. The English really doesn't translate it well, but the text indicates that Bathsheba was sent away, not that she just left. David could have kept her at the palace after sleeping with her, thereby honoring her. And then being the king, he could have paid Uriah for her. But instead, David shames her by sending her back. When she announced she was pregnant, this would have been public knowledge, as the text suggests she went through others to send the message to David. The account then focuses more on the conflict with Uriah. David calls for him from the front line, and this is an attempt for David to save face. In other words, David's goal is not having a clean conscience, but to protect his honor as king. If Uriah comes home and accepts his wife, then technically he would be accepting the child as his. Given the collectivist nature of ancient Israel, it is unlikely Uriah would not have been aware of why the king had sent for him. Supplies were always moving from the city to the front line, and news from home would have followed. Uriah was just a regular soldier. Kings were unlikely to summon random soldiers without good reason. So Uriah would likely have been wondering why the king had called for him. When Uriah arrives, David tells him to go home, wash his feet, and then he provides a gift. Again, kings would not summon a random soldier for no reason, let him return home to see his wife, and offer a gift. Uriah would likely have figured out the situation, or would have been made aware of the situation from someone else. But what we see is Uriah sleeps at the palace, and we are told he did so with the servants. So it would have been public knowledge Uriah did not go home, and therefore is not accepting payment or letting David off the hook. So David calls Uriah back, but this time it's not an innocent meeting. The king having a second meeting with a mere mercenary would have been perceived as a threat. David is essentially saying to take the gift and accept the child, or else return to the front line, where death is likely waiting. However, the way Uriah responds is not innocent either, and it is similar to the honor challenges Jesus had with the Pharisees. Uriah's response is meant to shame David in multiple ways. He says, "The ark in Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." Uriah notes all the men, except for David, are where they should be, fighting on the front line. Even God was there, symbolized by the ark. Second, Uriah reminds David that Joab is also on the front line doing David's job. And finally, Uriah makes a reference to sleeping with his wife, while no one in the army can currently go home to their wife. This seems to imply he knows what David had been doing, and he will not act in the same way. David tries to get Uriah to return home one more time, but it is clear that Uriah is refusing to allow David the honorable way out. So David has him sent back to the front line and has him killed. Notice in all of this, the authors never indicate David felt the weight of his conscience. He may have even considered it Uriah's fault. Instead of accepting the king's gift, the Hittite publicly shamed David in front of his servants. David defended what mattered in the ancient mindset, his honor. But here is where the authors seem to criticize this mentality. The community standard of honor was not good enough. God was offended by the immoral actions of David, and one should care more about what matters to God over your public honor. But even still, it's not until the prophet Nathan comes and publicly shames David by getting him to admit his own sin out loud does David realize the error of his ways. At no point in the story do we hear of the conviction of the Spirit of the Lord. David's mentality revolves around his honor. Only when he realizes that he has dishonored God through the affair and murder of Uriah does he experience remorse and a sense of guilt emerges. In other words, he dishonored God by acting as an improper image bearer through his actions. This is one way the biblical authors, working over several generations, eventually allow for feelings like guilt and a conscience to emerge. Despite the ancient world being steeped in an honor-shame paradigm, the biblical authors do not set this up as the ideal. One should actually care more about what matters to God than what matters to one's community. In another video, we point out the Torah began to implement some of these ideas early on, but their full effect would take years to realize. The Christian movement expanded upon this concept and placed a high emphasis on performing right actions based on God's requirements and not what the community saw as honorable. David deSilva says, "No member of the Jewish community or the Greco-Roman society would have come to faith or joined the Christian movement without first accepting that God's perspective on what kind of behavior merits honor differs exceedingly from the perspective of human beings. Since the message about Jesus is that both the Jewish and Gentile leaders of Jerusalem evaluated Jesus, his convictions and his deeds as meriting a shameful death. But God overturned their evaluation of Jesus by raising him from the dead and seating him at God's own right hand as Lord." In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." Paul is taking the concept of public shame and applying it to God's viewpoint. One day, each will be shamed based on our immoral actions, publicly before God and his servants. In other words, one should do what is good in the sight of God, because your identity now comes from him. So do what is honorable for the Lord and avoid what he will see as shameful. Christians are urged to be blameless before the Father in Christ, and one should do what is pleasing to God, instead of caring what members of the community think. To seek the approval of God primarily, and not the approval of the community. What is prized by humans is not necessarily prized by God. The apostles didn't conclude to entirely reject doing honorable acts in the sight of others, but seeking the honor of God is what one should have as their primary motive. When one seeks the approval of an omniscient God more than what the community demands, this helps to lay the foundation for concepts like internal guilt and a conscience to emerge. If your identity and honor now come from an omniscient being and not your community, we can understand how the culture began to think more about right and wrong beyond the community. As deSilva says, Christians are to remain focused on God's approval and on the actions that lead them, regardless of the world's response. Within that Christian framework, Jesus and the apostles taught duties and values like humility, taking care of others, and doing what is right regardless of another sees. So although the New Testament was written with the cultural background of an honor-shame society, it still was working to modify this understanding, so right and wrong were not only set by various communities, but by a God whose standards did not change and were not based on immoral reasoning. Christianity helped to contribute to honor and shame becoming less prominent, and an objective sense in right and wrong becoming more central.